Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Saliendo del Closet, the coming out process for Latinx queer communities and mental health considerations. Thank you for joining us. We are very grateful and glad to be joined by today's presenter, Dr. David Zelaya. Firstly, we would like to acknowledge that this presentation was done together by the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. It was prepared by us here at the NHL MHTTC under an agreement with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SANSA, and all the material that appear in this publication, except that the ones taken directly from copyright sources, is in the public domain and can be reproduced or copied without particular permission from SAMHSA or the authors. I'll be sure, as I'll say later on, to be sharing the handout by the end of the presentation for your use. But please, we always suggest that to cite the sources. It's really appreciated. We at the MHTPC network use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all our activities. We believe that words matter and language matters. So, as this and all of our activities, our language is friends-based and helpful, person first, and free of labels, among others. And so, as you all may know, today, October 11th, is National Coming Out Day, and the presentation today that we did today with Dr. David Zelaya, as part in collaboration with us, the National Hispanic Latino Center, want to promote not only this campaign but the needs of LGBTQ communities and particularly Hispanic Latino LGBTQ communities. So a few things to keep in mind during the webinar before we begin. If you have any technical issues, please, you can individually message me. I'm under Eric Senior in the chat section at the bottom of your screen, and I will be happy to assist you if you have any questions regarding buttons or how to interact with us. That being said, questions, answers, and comments for the speaker as we go along, you can address them by writing in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen as well. That would be the best way to address answers, comments that you might have along the way throughout the webinar as we discuss the topics. And as I mentioned, by the end of the webinar, I'll be sharing the handout for this presentation. And so now I would like to formally present Dr. David Zelaya. He's an assistant professor at Brown University School of Public Health within the Center of Alcohol and Addiction Studies, CAS, Department of Behavior and Social Sciences, and a research fellow at the Harvard Medical School within the Department of Psychiatry. His research program examines health disparities from intersectionality and minority stress lens among Black, Indigenous, and people of color and sexual and gender minority communities, and links to HIV risk, mental health, and substance use. Clinically, he is interested in providing culturally competent behavioral health services to historically underserved communities, Spanish-speaking Latinx people, sexual and gender diverse people. Dr. Zelaya received his PhD from Georgia State University in counseling psychology. He was a psychology resident at Harvard Medical School's Cambridge Hospital, part of the Latinx mental health program, the Gender and Sexuality Clinic, and the Psychiatric Emergency Service. Psychiatric Emergency Service. He completed his fellowship within the Alcohol Research Center on HIV, ARCH, and CAS at Brown SIH. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Dr. Zelaya now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Eric. Again, I'm really excited to be here. So today I'll be presenting on Saliendo del Closet, so the coming out process for Latinx queer communities and mental health considerations. So I don't need to repeat all of what Eric shared, but again, I'm an assistant professor here at Brown. I'm also the director for equity, diversity, and inclusion at the New England ATTC. And broadly, my program of research focuses on examining and centering the experiences of queer people of color, and specifically Latinx sexual and gender minorities, and looking at health disparities, HIV risk, and mental health and substance use, as well as intervention development. So in terms of the agenda for today of what I'll be covering, so I'll be going over some of the terminology, just so that we're all on the same page, and really underscoring the complexities around identity and how they're associated with the coming out process. I'll be touching on a conceptual lens, specifically the minority stress framework, to really help to contextualize the coming out process. Then I'll give an overview of some of the demographics of the Latinx queer community. Then I'll shift into discussing some of the most recent coming out research and mental health implications within the Latino queer community, and then ending with implications for clinical care. So a little bit of context for National Coming Out Day. So today marks the 33rd anniversary of National Coming Out Day. And really the day was developed to raise awareness around the LGBTQ community and the civil rights movement. It was founded in 1988 by psychologist Richard Eichberg and gay rights activist Jean O'Leary. And the marking of this date of the National Coming Out Day really helped to set the frame for influencing how we collect data around sexual and gender identity, which has really helped us come a long way around further understanding the unique health disparities that sexual and gender minority folks experience. So, but before that, I quickly want to start on a quick social positionality reflection statement, right? I think for all of us, it's important to consider our own social cultural identities, to really understand that our place in space is complex and that identities are contextual, right? So for myself, I identify as a Latino, immigrant, Nicaraguan American, queer, first gen, with educational privilege, right? And so those are some of the cultural lenses through which I do my research and my clinical work, and ultimately how the presentation was created and being delivered today as well, right? And so I really encourage the audience to take a moment to reflect on your own identities, and really try to consider what are some potential sort of blind spots or biases that we might have, that as we become aware of those, it really helps us become better researchers and clinicians as well. So in terms of terminology, I want to start with coming out and sort of what that means and how that might look like. But before that, I would love just to get some input from the audience in terms of when you hear the term coming out, what sort of comes to mind? What do you think about? And I can, and then we can go from there. So in terms of coming out and what that looks like, right? So this is the process by which an individual begins to recognize their sexual or gender minority identity. And the reason why we have the coming out process to begin with is that it's rooted in heterosexuality and heteronormative systems of oppression, right? Which assumes that heterosexuality is the norm and their prototypical identity. For many racial and ethnic minorities, this process is complicated by cultural factors, right? Which I'll delve into today, that really highlights the effects of la familia, respeto, etc. Most of the research we have out there suggests that coming out is associated with mental health well-being. But again, it's important to understand how the impact of race and culture ultimately impacts this experience and this process. To where the closet paradigm has been argued to center a Western and white queer lens that might not be applicable to all racial ethnic minorities. And I think it's important for us to remember that racial and ethnic minorities, and in this case, the Latino community, is managing their identity across different contexts, right? Whether it be part of the larger LGBTQ community, as well as within their Latino community, and really underscoring that the process of coming out is oftentimes a lifelong one for people, right? Whether it's coming out at work, it's coming out in new relationships and new friendships, and that that this is sort of a process that happens across the lifespan and multiple times. So really quickly, to give an overview of what the stages of sexual minority identity formation are, this was proposed by Cass in 1979, starting with identity confusion, right, where people begin to realize that they have a sexual minority identity, shifting into identity comparison, where people begin to compare that identity to that of their idea of what heterosexuality looks like, moving towards identity tolerance, where people begin to present their sexual minority identity to others, starting to share it, etc. Moving towards identity acceptance, where folks are interacting with other sexual minority people more frequently, and then shifting into identity pride, right? Which are why we have Pride Month, where folks begin to enjoy, appreciate, and celebrate that identity, all the way into synthesis, right? Where sort of all the different pieces come together as a whole, where folks begin to integrate their various forms of their identity. In terms of the coming out continuum, again, I just quickly wanted to provide a visual of what this looks like, right? Starting with denial, so denying that this identity might be present, moving into opposition, tolerance, recognition, then developing this understanding, acceptance, and ultimately this process of celebration. I think it's also important that we understand that terminology and language are incredibly important for how people identify, and how people come to identify might also be a reflection of their process along their identity development, right? And so for sexual youth, their sexual orientation identification varies greatly, right? Ranging from demisexual to heteroflexible, queer, demisexual, again, so really staying current with the language that's being used with the folks that we're working with is incredibly important. And this is also true for gender minorities as well, right? Knowing that language is always growing and ever changing, whether it be gender neutral, trigender, queer, non-binary, etc. So really wanting to underscore that the language around sexual and gender minority identification varies greatly, and the importance that we just ask, right, how people identify. So some quick stats for LGBTQ people, right? So this was actually from CNN today. So 4 out of 5 LGBTQ people keep their identities hidden from most folks. There's been a sharp increase in violence and onslaught of anti-LGBTQ legislation within the recent years. Furthermore, only 23 states and the District of Columbia have explicit workplace protections for LGBTQ people, right? So when folks are thinking about coming out, this is a thought process that folks are engaging in around, does my work have certain laws that will protect me if I come out, or what if I get outed, right? So these are all some of the cultural considerations that the folks are having to manage as a result of their sexual or gender minority identity. And again, knowing that many countries still possess harmful laws that are anti-LGBTQ, right, that are punishable by imprisonment and death sentences. So shifting into the Latinx queer community, approximately 5.6 of Latinx folks identify as LGBTQ+, and almost 200,000 folks who are LGBTQ and Latinx are also undocumented immigrants, right? So that adds an extra layer of having to navigate various systems. Most of the Latinx LGBTQ adult population are women at 52%, and 48% are men. Overall, we find that the Latinx LGBTQ adult population is younger than the population of Latinxs that are not LGBTQ adults. So roughly 65% of Latinx LGBTQ adults are under the age of 35. and the vast majority of Latinx queer adults live in urban areas, right? So really trying to contextualize and frame the demographics of the Latinx LGBTQ population, to where we see that most folks tend to reside out in the West, followed by the Southeast, and then in New England, and then the Midwest. To where there are also really true concerns and challenges that Latinx sexual and gender minority folks encounter, right? To where nearly 40% of folks live in a household income that's below $24,000 per year. Latinx LGBTQ adults are more likely to be underemployed and more likely to encounter food insecurity compared to their heterosexual counterparts. Roughly 27% of Latinx LGBTQ youth have reported experiencing homelessness or housing instability within the past year. And about 16% of Latinx LGBTQ youth have attempted suicide within the past year, right? So really underscoring the unique challenges that are faced by our communities. So really quickly shifting into the conceptual lens of the minority stress framework, right? So, but before that, really quickly want to underscore that Latinx sexual and gender minority folks are living at the intersection of two NIH health disparity groups, right? So the NIH identifies health disparities groups as communities that have a higher incident of prevalence, morbidity, and mortality from specific health concerns that are above and beyond that of the general public, right? And so they've identified sexual and gender minority communities, as well as racial and ethnic minority communities, and Latinx sexual and gender minority folks are living at the intersection of these two groups, right? So really increasing the risks that they encounter. So what is minority stress? And some folks might be familiar with this term already, so apologies, but minority stress was originally coined by Virginia Brooks in 1981, and then popularized by Elon Meyer in 1995 and 2003, to where ultimately the minority stress framework posits that these are unique forms of stress in addition to your everyday stressors that are experienced by marginalized groups, that they are chronic, right? So to where they are related to the underlying social and cultural structures, i.e. oppression, right? That being heterosexism, racism, cissexism, and that they're socially based, meaning that they happen from social processes and institutions and structures outside of the individual, right? To where ultimately minority stress are these forms of stressors that are above and beyond your everyday stressors that somebody experiences as a result of their socially marginalized identity, right? So you have a socially marginalized identity, you experience chronic forms of stress, whether they be proximal or distal, that then ultimately result in negative mental and physical health outcomes. To where, again, they can present in proximal and in distal ways, right? So the proximal sort of mechanism happens through this internal subjective experience that folks rely on when appraising their environment, to where this can result in internalized stigma, rejection sensitivity, and concealment of identity, right? Whereas you have the more distal events that might be a bit more objective, right? Such as structural stigma, the onslaught of anti-LGBTQ bills that we've seen being passed recently, anti-gay violence, etc. To where I quickly want to zone in on internalized stigma, rejection sensitivity, and concealment of sexual identity. To where internalized stigma, right, also known as internalized homophobia, internalized heterosexism, and internalized transphobia, is the process of internalizing society's normative gender expectations or biases, right? To where research has shown that higher levels of machismo or machista attitudes tends to be correlated with higher levels of internalized stigma, right? To where I start to believe that me being gay is bad, right? Furthermore, the process of rejection sensitivity, right? So this is where your brain starts to expect that you're going to be rejected as a result of your sexual orientation, right? To where this contributes to this hypervigilance of cues of potential biases and intense affective reactions to rejection, right? So if I grew up going to the Catholic Church hearing, right, that being gay is bad, I might be anticipating that rejection maybe the next time I meet a priest, right? So sort of that process. As well as concealment of identity, right, which is really pertinent to the coming out process, and to where this is sort of the process of maybe going back into the closet depending on the context or the environment that somebody is in, right? To where this might also be a protective factor, right? To where it can help shield you against possible forms of rejection. To where we've seen that the process of hiding one's identity further increases experiences of isolation from one's family within the Latinx queer community. To where I think when we're working with folks, it's important to consider, is this a form of internalized stigma, or are these very true safety concerns that individual might be holding? Finally, minority stress has been linked to increased rates of substance use, increased rates of psychological distress, and lower levels of physical health as well. That we'll see that in terms of the coming out process, it's nicely situated within the minority stress framework as well. It's also important to remember the experiences of Latinx sexual minority and gender minority folks, and that, again, they're living at the intersection of two different groups, right? That being the LGBTQ community and their Latino community, to where they oftentimes report experiencing racism within the LGBTQ community, heterosexism within communities of color, right? So homophobia within their Latino community, as well as racism in close relationships and dating, to where even in my own research, I found that experiencing rejection from your own Latino community tends to be the most distressing for people, as opposed to these other two constructs. So really highlighting the importance of community, la familia, etc. So finally getting to the crux of the presentation for today, right? Latinx communities coming out and mental health. But before that, I think there is power in stories and in narratives. So I quickly want to show this video that really highlights the process of coming out, some of the Latino cultural values, and so I will stop there.
My dad asked me to go outside, and he goes, "What's wrong with your mom?" I'm like, "I don't know." "Well, what's wrong with your mom?" And he was smoking a cigarette, and I said, "Well, okay, I'm gay." And then he happened to be inhaling at the time, and he just took a long inhale, like he was gonna finish the whole cigarette, like, "With Gabby." It hurts. It still hurts, not just because you have one, it makes it easier on the second one. You go through the same thing.
When I was 16, I got the opportunity to go on a pilgrimage to Israel and to the Holy Land, and to really experience that whole moment of Jesus Christ and that whole life of him. I stood up to become a priest, and they had said, "We really need you to find out, is this what you want? Not for the church, not for anyone, but for you. Are you gay? Are you hiding from something? Are you here to figure out who you are? Is this really for you?" It's more, I'm here out of fear because I didn't know any better.
My parents strived to make sure that I was, the queen of the church. I had my quinceañera with the big fluffy dress, and then I felt like a princess. They afforded me all of those cultural things, try to make me feel special as the girl. She made me cut my hair. and diet. Yeah, she did. She's like, Amita, you look so pretty. Da, 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 da.
You dye your hair? What
Yes,
was that?
yes, you made me get highlights and you made me cut my hair. I had hair down to my waist and you made it cut right here to go to Culiacan. Yes, you sure did.
I don't remember.
Trust, I remember. The hardest part of coming out is to know that you're about to hurt someone that you love, their dreams, some way crushing their dreams and their perception of how life is supposed to be in our culture.
I told my mom, and she just kind of sat there in bed, kind of like, you know, her head's nodding. And my dad had saw me walk in crying, and he comes into the room and she's like, we have another child that, you know, it's gay. The relationship that her and I had built really gained distance. You have to be open-minded that they have fears.
At the time, I did feel I had something to do with it, or maybe I didn't take care of him like the way he should, and maybe something happened to him and I wasn't around. Of course, if you ask any parent, everybody's going to tell you, no, I don't want to have a gay kid. It hurts me, you know, because they treat them like they're no good. They're different. They're not persons. They're different than us normal people. You kind of know it because you know your kids, you know. Like with Guillermo, I saw it when he was 3 years old. And with Samantha, I saw it, but I didn't want to admit it. You know, she went out with a couple of boys, and I thought, well, you know, hoping no, maybe not, you know. But Guillermo, there was no doubt in my mind. Guillermo and Samantha are two different things.
So I'm happy to share the link for this video if folks want to keep watching it. But I think what this really highlights is the impact of Latino cultural values on the coming out process, right? Whether it be culture and religion, and whether that be the Catholic Church or connection to the Catholic Church, right? Or family and societal perceptions, right? Kind of referring to gender roles, right? So where within the Latino community, the concept of Marianismo, right? So where women are expected to get married and have kids, and men are going to be a provider, right? To where sort of the coming out process is one, sort of a counter narrative to some of these sort of value systems per se, to where I think part of what the video also highlighted is that the parents also go through their own coming out process of either having to tell other people within the family system, as well as potentially grieving their own sort of experience, their own sort of dreams for that child, right? To where, but I think ultimately at the root of it is the power of community and love that our community really holds near and dear. To where research has shown, right, that positive parental reactions to their child coming out is associated with lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of depression, lower suicide attempts, increased resilience, and higher levels of self-esteem. Whereas a negative parental reaction is linked with higher depressive symptoms, suicide attempts, suicidal ideation, increased substance use, and lower levels of self-esteem. To where, again, right, so the Latinx value systems are at the core of coming out and might potentially influence, right, how and when people decide to disclose and come out, right? To where when we're working with families, holding these clearly, it is really able to help us inform treatment, right? Considering the role of respeto, right? And it is the process of me coming out sort of going counter to that. How might my internalized gender norms of machista attitudes and sort of hearing negative slurs against queer people how might that influence my coming out process, right? So I quickly want to highlight a couple of the coming out experiences for various communities. So for Latinx gay men, research has found that cultural norms strongly influence how folks cope, right? So for this study in specific, this was the process of Latinx gay men coming out to their fathers, right? So where one of the ways that they used to cope with a negative experience of coming out to their father was substance use. Whereas on the flip side of that, in terms of mental health, some folks have reported feeling anxious and having higher levels of generalized anxiety symptoms, whereas other folks have been able to tap into different resources, into different forms of social supports when the coming out experience didn't go well, to where some folks have also reported a sense of freedom, right? Feeling that they're able to live their true and authentic self once they were able to come out to their father. In terms of the coming out process for Latinx, bi, and plurisexual individuals, right? So we know that bisexual folks tend to have some of the highest levels of mental health concerns within the LGBTQ community as a result of the experiences of biphobia that they experience both from the heterosexual community as well as the gay and lesbian community, right? To where the process for bisexual Latinx people might be even harder than for Latinx, gay, and lesbian lesbian individuals. To where ultimately there are various factors that go on within the context of deciding to disclose one's bisexual identity within the context of your Latinx community, right? This was a qualitative study by Abreu and colleagues that when their qualitative themes found that in terms of their decision-making process when folks are going to come out, is that they are thinking of many different sort of factors, right? They think about their own religious upbringing. They think about possibly being invalidated, disregarded, and erased, right? We know that by erasure is a very true construct within the broader LGBTQ community. They're thinking about possibly experiencing rejection, how their family might respond to that disclosure of their sexual orientation identity, and if they're going to be accepted. They think about possibly negative attitudes against bisexuality, and one of the biggest themes that they found was this fear of being excluded from the overall collective of the Latino community and experiencing violence, right? To where there are also sort of specific social cultural factors that influence the family's reaction to a bisexual Latino person disclosing that identity, right? And that being religion and spirituality, family and respeto, and having strict views of gender norms seems to influence how the family reacts to that disclosure. And some other things that impact the family's reaction on the individual. So how folks felt after disclosing that identity is that some reported feeling validated and affirmed, some were hurt and disappointed, some were relieved and confident, and others engaged in that proximal form of minority stress discussed earlier of identity concealment, right? To where other folks reported having a stronger bond after coming out, to where other people reported feeling distant, disrupted, and strained. Then the coming out process for Hispanic sexual minority young adults, right? So what this process looks like is one, recognizing their sexual identity. They contemplate self-disclosure. They might decide to disclose or not to disclose. They might rationalize coming out. Some Hispanic youth reported being outed, right? So that's when somebody tells other people about your sexual minority identity before you have the chance or even want to come out. Some folks tend to strategize their self-disclosures by telling some people over others. Some experienced consequences after coming out, such as being either kicked out of their home or fractured relationships their parents, and finally we see again the same theme of cultural factors being incredibly important in the coming out process for Latinx sexual minority folks. And finally, really wanting to push against the fact of this verbal disclosure idea, right? That in order for a gay person to be happy, I need to be out and say that I'm gay, right? To where research has shown that there are some potential benefits around nonverbal disclosures, right? And I quickly want to show a clip by Juan Gabriel during a interview that he had.
Dicen que es gay. Juan Gabriel es gay. Dicen que lo que se ve no se pregunta, amigo.
Right, so lo que se ve no se pregunta, right? And so this was an article by, so before I get to that, there are various forms of nonverbal disclosures that research has shown that is present within the Latino queer community, right? So that could be in the form of attending a family function with a partner. It could be a public display of affection. It could be bringing a queer friend to a family function, or just having a sticker or like a rainbow sticker and showing that you support LGBTQ civil rights, right? To where Teluccio and colleagues had an article titled Lo que se ve no se pregunta, that really underscores that previous theoretical models really emphasize that disclosing one's identity is a really important step in the identity development, which has been linked to better mental health concerns. But again, these models reinforce an all or nothing binary form of thinking. And again, some folks argue that this coming out process and verbal disclosures might be more rooted within the experiences of white gay cisgender men. That oftentimes these nonverbal disclosures are quite common, right? And the part of what these nonverbal disclosures might help to do is that your family your family might help accept that identity. It could help avoid any possible negative reaction, and it might help to preserve some of those family bonds, right? And that again, nonverbal disclosures are not the same as being in the closet, right? To where some folks might have a tia that comes for every Christmas, or a tia's roommates, right? That there might never have been that process of verbally disclosing that identity. So there are also several notable gaps in the research out there around the coming out research scholarly work, right? There's really limited work around Latinx older queer communities and the coming out process. There's a very few articles around Latinx queer women in the coming out process, and also even less around Latinx trans and gender diverse communities and the coming out process, right? So really wanting to underscore that we have a lot of work to do as a field as we begin to tackle and try to decrease some of the health disparities encountered by this community. So some key takeaways, right, is that coming out is not the goal for everybody, and that there are true safety concerns involved with that. Coming out is not a linear process, and some folks might go through the coming out process multiple times throughout their life. Coming out looks differently for everybody, right? And culture is a huge, significant influence in this process. And I think it's also important that we begin to combat false narratives, right? I think the media at times has the tendency to portray the Latino community and families as being homophobic and anti-gay, right? But the data show otherwise. Half of Hispanics now in favor of legal gay marriage, right? We see that about 52% in 2012 were in favor of gay marriage. And this was another study by the Pew Research Center which queried should homosexuality be accepted or discouraged, to where we largely see that most folks said it should be accepted, right? And even just by 1 point, but I'm going to take that 1 point, right? That that all Hispanics said that homosexuality should be accepted. At one higher point, than the general population. So as I wrap up, implications for clinical care. Again, I think going back to the social positionality statement, I think we need to meet our patients and clients where they're at, right? It's not our job to decide when they should come out and who they should come out to. So part of what cultural humility allows us to do is that we let the client be the expert in their own experience, right? That we are lifelong learners in this process. Really understanding that safety and security always come first for that individual that we're working with. And that education and allyship are key, right? Education for ourselves as well as the broader Latino community as well, right? And so there are some really great resources out there. This is a guía de recursos para salir del closet by the HRC. There is a great website called Familia es Familia, which is a public campaign in partnership with several national Hispanic organizations that aim to really increase increase education around LGBTQ health concerns. And there is another resource coming out and living authentically as an LGBTQ Latinx person. Furthermore, as clinicians, it's important that we support family members in their own process, right? As we saw in the video, sometimes parents go through their own grieving process when a child might come out. And it's sort of our job as clinicians, right, to maybe engage in that family therapy to try to rupture some of those relationships as well. To where I quickly want to highlight more great work by Dr. Roberto Abreu, who created expressive writing intervention with Cuban American and Puerto Rican parents of LGBTQ individuals, right? So the prompt was, so please write a letter to another parent, someone like yourself, describing your journey toward accepting your own LGBTQ child and young adults. In that letter, please include aspects of your heritage, cultural beliefs, and value systems as a Cuban or Puerto Rican American parent that helped you on this journey, providing examples, etc. And then a follow-up question of sharing a short description of the feelings experienced as a result of writing that story and their own sort of personal journey toward accepting their LGBTQ child, right? So really using different forms of intervention in working with the family dynamics to really take care of the child that might have just come out. So finally, I end with highlighting a couple tools, a couple other tools and resources out there that have been developed to really center the experiences of sexual and gender minority folks. One I'll quickly highlight is by Dr. John Pachenkis that really incorporates the minority stress framework, and it tackles family rejection, peer rejection, religious exclusion, etc. And I believe this is about 10 modules or so that folks can use. And finally, I end with a reminder of why I do the work that I do, right? The Pulse Orlando nightclub shooting was an attack on our Latinx queer community, right? Folks who were out and proud and living their life and ultimately had their lives cut short. That again, I think it's important that we center and really keep remembering their faces and their names. So I thank you for having me today, and I think I still have some time for questions. I'm happy to connect via email, and feel free to follow me on Twitter. And Eric, I think I'll let you sort of cover this slide.
Thank you, Dr. Zelaya, and thank you everyone for joining us and for this excellent presentation you brought up. There's a few questions that people have been bringing up, and we can go through them as best as possible. I would like to remind everyone as we do that This is a link, QR code for an evaluation. I'll share the link itself through the chat shortly. This is just a great way for us to get the way to get funding to bring such great presenters as Dr. Zelaya. So I'll start addressing some of these questions we have here. One comes from Anthony Aguirre. What tools can you give to someone who isn't sure if they are members of the LGBTQ community due to the pressure from society or because of sexual curiosity?
Yeah, I would direct you to the HRC website, and in my slides on page 57, slide 57, sorry, the guide that's also available in English and in Spanish around coming out of the closet, I think really beautifully captures some of those initial questions that folks might have when they're sort of engaging in the sort of in the possible first steps of identity development and contact and formation. So I would direct them to the HRC, I think, as a starting point.
Thank you. Great, Dr. Zelaya. So here's one other question from Gabriela Laiseca. Do you have some resources for working with Hispanic families that have young children that are beginning to identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community?
Yes. And I don't have them on the slides for some reason, but Gabriela, if you email me, I'd be happy to send them to you. And I can put my email in the chat, or if you can.
Yeah. What I'll start doing as well, I'll share with everyone the handout. So, and there in the handout, you'll get to the Dr. Zelaya's email. So it's uploading to the handout button. When it's done, I'll let everyone know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and thank you for adding your email to the chat. Okay. So as we go, as we keep gathering some questions here from the audience, I have one question from Cristina Romero.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how similar or dissimilar research findings are for persons of tribal backgrounds, especially, and I hope that, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce this right, especially Yaqui or Oahu, whom many are also Latinx or part of Latinx communities, possibly.
Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, I think part of where my mind goes is rooted in the history of colonization within the Americas, right, and sort of how sexual orientation and gender identity was previously viewed by our indigenous communities, and how the process of enforcing these certain value systems really shifted the way that we conceptualize folks, has really created these forms of trauma. So that's sort of where my mind goes, and I don't think I'm fully answering your question right now, but in terms of how dissimilar or similar tribal background is within the context of sexual and gender identity, was that the question, Eric?
Yeah, I'm going back to the question itself. So I'm wondering how similar or dissimilar research findings are for persons of tribal backgrounds.
Yeah.
You know, so that more concretely, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm not super familiar with that area.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'd be happy to track down some resources.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a few questions, and thank you everyone for being so engaged and bringing these great insights and sharing. From Lydia Kennedy, we have a question mentioning excellent presentation. Lydia asks, what are the ways to support yourself with negative responses from mom and family members?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think this is part of what we see is the importance of social support, right? Of having various systems in place of folks where you are able to feel safe, where you're able to feel heard, where you're able to feel understood. I think oftentimes what we're seeing now within the younger generations and LGBTQ youth is the amount of social support that they're getting online and via social media. I think that has drastically changed the landscape and the field to where I believe a recent study showed that most youth and teenagers tended to report that they tended to get more social support via online as opposed to those in-person interpersonal sort of relationships.
Right, thank you. So I have another question here, and I'll read it first in Spanish, but I'll read it in Spanish and then translate it to all in English as best as possible. Comes from Leslie. ¿Usted entiende que el trauma complejo puede afectar o influir en la decisión de salir del closet? ¿O puede crearse un trauma cuando no tomas la decisión de salir del closet? That would be this my best translation. I'll try here. Do you understand that complex trauma can affect or influence the decision of coming out, or can it create trauma when one decides to come out?
Yeah, I think there's a chance for a bi-directional relationship, right, between these two, and I think for many folks who don't decide to come out, it's usually rooted in very true safety concerns, right? So whether it be within their community, within their society, if they live in countries where being gay is punishable by death, right? I'm likely not to come out. And it's part of why we see various forms of asylum cases, right, for people who are sexual and gender minorities from different countries because of that fear of persecution, right? So I think both can be true, right? That I think you can try to protect yourself from some of the societal pressures, and I think that coming out looks different for everybody, and that there isn't, again, sort of one right way to come out, and that it looks different within the Latino community. And I think we're just starting to scratch the field around what this process looks like, right? I think from one of my slides, there's still so much we don't know that hasn't been studied within the Latino community around coming out. Most of the research is done within Latino gay men, and oftentimes it's done within the context of HIV, right? That I think one of my biggest points is the need to move away from a risk-based perspective and one more towards a strengths-based perspective. But so yeah, those are some of my initial thoughts and reactions to that question.
Thank you, Dr. Zelaya. In the meantime, when we have maybe a few minutes for the last question, could you pull up the QR code again for our audience? I did share the evaluation link, which is the same as the QR code for anyone there. I would also be sharing a book that came out, which Dr. Zelaya and is a co-author of with other members, Dr. Oscar Rojas and Dr. Nancy Herrera. It's a fabulous and great book, and you can find it, of course, in our website for National Hispanic and Latino. We have a Facebook page, YouTube page. So some people have been asking, will this be recorded? And it's recorded and will be up in our YouTube page as soon as we're possible. There you can find other great speakers addressing similar topics in mental health for Hispanic and Latino populations. So I want to address, with the time we have left, maybe this question, common question by Virginia Quiñones, and I think it brings up the topic of spirituality and religiosity. The comment and questions is, you mentioned the Catholic Church, but many Latinx belong to other Christian groups, including very conservative Christian sects. Is there any research that shows the impact of very conservative beliefs? And are there any differences compared to other religions?
Yes, there is one research there's this one article out there that talks about, of course, the priest doesn't know, I believe is the title of that article, which highlights the process of what it would have been like for that person to come out. I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at religious differences in terms of coming out and acceptance. But I do know that there are some studies that highlight the complexity of religion as a cultural factor for the coming out process, and oftentimes feeling at odds with that identity and those belief systems, and some folks really being able to pull the positive sort of things of those teachings, while also being able to leave behind some of the negative messages. But I'm not sure of studies that have looked at sort of mean differences across religious groups, but really highlighting that there is a really complex connection between the Catholic Church, that some folks are able to sort of take the good and sort of leave the bad.
Thank you, Dr. Zelaya. We would love to continue this conversation. We have so many great questions from our audience. Unfortunately, maybe we can give 2 more minutes, as we started maybe 2 more minutes late on. So if it's okay, can I address one more question to you? I see that a lot of our other members are still here.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. As a non-Latina and heterosexual person, what are ways I can be positive, constructive support, or ally? What are best ways for me to spread awareness or get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. I would look for any local community groups that work with the Latino gay community, or the broader queer community. I think oftentimes little things go a long way, right? So even having this is a safe space sticker on your door or your cubicle really makes a difference, right? When we talk about systems of oppression and what that looks like, one of the ways that happens is through the form of exclusion, right? And I think to the extent that we can make spaces and physical spaces more inclusive is one way to further build the process of being an ally towards the community. In terms of spreading awareness and getting involved, yeah, the HRC has some great training and resources. The Familia es Familia also has some great trainings as well. Getting involved with PFLAG and other LGBTQ community groups as well. Yeah, and then I think really trying to capitalize on your skill set, right? What are some of the specific skills that you have, and how can you use those skills to further support the Latino queer population at large?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zelaya, for that insight, for receptiveness. Again, I think speaking from a place of not only cultural competence but cultural humility, bring this insight and great knowledge around this topic, so present and relevant to our times and to our Hispanic and Latinx communities. That being said, that will be all the time we have for today. We want to thank everyone who has joined, and thank you for your engagement, your comments, your questions, your support. Again, feel free to join us through our next events, which you can find in our National Hispanic and Latino MHTT webpage. Until then, thank you, Dr. Zelaya, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.